All right, today I will be talking about Hard Like Water by Lianke and translated by Carlos Rojas. And this is an interesting one because I was having a really, really hard time reading this book because I honestly cannot remember why the fuck I came across this particular book. Usually, this is where I talk about context and how I came to find the book. This one, I have no clue, like no fucking clue at all. I remember getting it. I just don't remember how I ended up interested in this particular book. So it's pretty low on my pile of things to get through before I leave. So it's not really surprising then that I didn't have a ton of enthusiasm going into it. And indeed, for all of the week, I read about 150 pages, 160 pages, and then during the weekend, got through the last 300, not 300, 250 pages. And yeah, so I guess curiously, let's get into it in terms of summary. This is a book about Aizhong and Hongmei, who are. It's set during the Cultural Revolution in China, which I'm really, really glad that I read. I believe it was Mo Yan's Frog and Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out, the latter of which you can see I did a review of, because that gave me a lot of the necessary groundwork to understanding this book, specifically with regards to the Cultural Revolution, what it was and where it kind of fell in Chairman Mao's various reforms in China and how a lot of those were executed. So in that sense, I really understood where this book was coming from in the way that you kind of think of if you don't know much about the Chinese Communist Revolution, you might not appreciate that there were kind of multiple revolutions going on, of which one of them was the Cultural Revolution, during which a lot of China's past architecture and whatnot was taken down by youthful extreme radicals because, long story short, basically Chairman Mao saw the Communist Revolution but thought that the people who had taken over for the Communist Revolution were themselves becoming corrupt, so envisioned a kind of perpetual revolution in which things are always getting better. And in fact, what this led to was a lot of young people coming into power and basically McCarthyism and witch trials, but except, you're not communist enough, you're not a believer in a cause, and a lot of young people taking over and just general chaos and panic, and hundreds of thousands of people died as a result. And what this book does is really examines the hollowness and emptiness of the people who explore these ideas, because it follows Aizhong, whose name literally means love of the military. It's a first-person narrative, so you're really inside his head. And what made this book so challenging to read was the combination of the fact that Aizhong is really an unlikable person, is a selfish, egocentric douchebag with absolutely no prospect for self-reflection, but also because it's really, really just descriptive and filled to the brim with slogans, which, bless the translator note at the end. As many books put the, not translator, but forwards, obviously at the front of the book, which a forward almost always contains spoilers for the book that you're about to read. Like, why the fuck would you put that at the start of the book? This is a situation where I'm glad that I read the translator note at the end of the book, about 50 pages into the book, because it really helps to contextualize a lot of the wordplay going on in the book that is just inevitably going to be lost in translation. If you don't know, being a logographic language, Chinese has a lot of wordplay baked into its history, and a lot of this has its roots in revolution and political not dissonance, disconnect, no, oh god, I'm drawing a blank on the word political God, protest, basically. Dissent, I guess. Um, where you could write something that on the surface seemed very pro, but because of the way that I don't want to say kanji because I know that's the Japanese word for it, but I don't know what the Chinese characters are called actually in Chinese. But so basically, I'm going to just say kanji can be read multiple different ways, have multiple different meanings, and when paired with each other can take on new meanings. So a lot of wordplay and political dissent took place via this kind of wordplay. And here, what you have are a lot of quotations from Chairman Mao, and the main character speaks. I don't want to say primarily, but like a lot in these kinds of quotations. And thankfully, the translator explains some of these quotes and how in the original text they weren't really noted as quotes, and how he has noted some as quotes, but it's really a play on these quotes from Chairman Mao and how they are being perverted and manipulated into the main characters, into justifications for the main character's actions. So I really appreciate that and how it helped add another layer of appreciation to this, because this is about how Aizhong leaves the military in order to continue the revolution, and on his way back sees Hong Mei at the train station, and they're not actually at the station, they're farther along. He's wandered away and he's kind of on the tracks, and these revolutionary songs start playing, and they just start making out, and it really drives their sexual passion, these songs. But as soon as the songs quit, it dies completely. And this is the start of a romance between them that really compels them to increasingly more and more radical things in the name of revolution and in the name of their illicit love. And this is another thing one of the translators note is really important in understanding where this novel is coming from, because it mentions that there was a kind of popular book coming into play in China, which is called like the Revolutionary Romance, and how it was really about romances forming during the revolution, not necessarily the Cultural Revolution, but any of the various stages of the communist revolution in China. To sort of take that revolutionary thing and pair it with romance became really popular, as it can, I think anybody who really has, a critical eye for media can see that it's very popular to take any kind of major political or historical situation and kind of pair it with an illicit romance and make it, sexy and spicy and draw attention. So a lot of times I talk about satire and not being able to fully appreciate the satire. And while that is true here, the translator's note gives you enough context, and the satire is definitely blunt enough that I think that anybody can appreciate what's going on here. So in terms of to whom would I recommend this book to, I mean, if any of the stuff that I've said already sounds interesting, then I would recommend it to you. But I do think where Mao Yan's books give you a better idea of the history of the situation and kind of walking you through that, this definitely feels more like something for somebody who already understands the history of what's going on, because it makes brief allusions to things, but doesn't give like the hard dates, the hard timeline in an easy to follow way. So if you don't already know something about Chinese history, specifically the Communist Revolution during the stage, which I'm not pretending like I'm an expert or anything, just having that ground knowledge made this book a lot easier to approach, I feel. And even then, I feel like a lot of it went over my head. So if you're up for that challenge, then give it a read. Just be aware. And this is kind of where I move into the pros and cons. My biggest con for this book is it is incredibly overwritten. At times, I feel like that is the point, where the main character's ego is certainly central to the whole experience. And his constant repetitions, his constant falling back on praise is really meant to drive home how he doesn't have a single original thought in his being. Everything is just comprised of these slogans and these God, God, quotes and, oh God, what's this? Not amorphisms, adages, basically, of which he is, not to touch on themes, but of which he recites without necessarily caring about the meaning of, because the meaning always adapts to suit whatever the hell is his current ambition and goal. And well, in that sense, the book is very effective at capturing that hollowness and emptiness. It can get really, really fucking tedious to read over the 410 pages the book is, and they're 410 pretty hefty pages, not like super dense or anything, but not super light either, as is always kind of the struggle with talking about page count versus word count. So in that sense, I think that's like the biggest strike against the book. That's the biggest thing that made it difficult to get into it, where I understand the purpose, and that's why I think it accomplishes its purpose. It just goes a little bit too hard in the paint. So it's kind of a pro and a con. It's a pro that too much of a good thing becomes a con. Another thing is I guess the style of the book is really so much of the book, because things that I would normally criticize, at least here, are done in a way that they clearly have a purpose and they clearly lend to what the overall sense of the book is going for. So I already mentioned the constant repetitions and how it's frustrating to read, but at the same time, it reinforces the emptiness of the main character. So another example is outside of Aizhong and, God, why am I drawing? Hong Mei. There are other characters in the story, but it's amazing how little screen time they get. And again, this is by choice. It really is by virtue of being a first-person narrative, Aizhong's account of his own actions, and consequently, it is entirely focused on himself and Hong Mei. Nobody else really has a place in it. And when people do sort of pop up, it's in these kind of demented forms that clearly pervert who they really are, because it's sort of toying with you in that way. So again, it's frustrating in the sense that you don't really ever get to see a wider picture. You are constantly stuck in this claustrophobic view. But at the same time, that claustrophobic view is exactly how such a narrow-minded person thinks. So it's annoying to read, but it has a purpose. Same with Aizhong himself being such an unlikable dickhead. And one of the strengths of the novels, I think I mentioned this in the submission review, but if I didn't, the way Wolbeck talks about it as the novel really is the best means we have of really experiencing what it is to be another person, because like film, you have the camera. I did like first person specifically, because film, you have a camera. Art, you can draw it, but really, games, you can interact with something. But games are kind of the worst for that, because it just puts you in control of the character rather than really making them their own person. But a book, a first-person perspective, really does put you directly into the thoughts of another person in a way that other art doesn't quite accomplish. And it's in that it can be so powerful, but in the case of something like Hard Like Water, can make it so revolting. And it's frustrating, really, and not the easiest thing in the world to read this book, because of how absolutely terrible and selfish Aizhong is as a person. But I think it also is really good at challenging what I talked about when I talked about Murakami's South of the Border, the Rest of the Sun, where we always have this implicit desire to sympathize with the first-person protagonist, to empathize with them. They're not only our surrogate eyes into the world, but we are in their minds, which means that if somebody criticizes them, it's almost like they're criticizing us. So when things go great for the first person protagonist, we feel strongly elated, and when things go bad, we feel almost personally slighted. Which, when you then take the first person protagonist and make them a piece of shit, then it really challenges you as a reader to create that sort of separation, to recognize, to empathize without sympathizing, or really appreciate that divide between the two. And that can be a struggle, and especially, again, like I said, when you have such a terrible character across such a long book, it can be a real pain in the ass. But I appreciate why it did it this way, and I think that if it did it any other way, it wouldn't be as good. So really, like I said, the style is everything about this book, both in terms of what it accomplishes and what it pulls off, but also in terms of what making it really kind of rough to get through. So moving on into themes, which is where I kind of go into hard spoilers. So if you do want to read this book, bail out now. But the themes of the book, again, when you're talking about revolution and language and the relationship between political action and lust and desire, both sexually and non-sexually, and kind of how it all bundles together. Obviously, the sexual aspect and component is the bigger aspect thematically of the book. And unfortunately, it's the one that doesn't interest me quite as much, but it has to be acknowledged because it is so central to the book. The fact that Aijung and Hong Mei's passions only light up during whenever external slogans are piped into them, but then whenever it's just them alone, Aijung becomes impotent. Whenever it has to exist solely on their love and their human connection, he is utterly unable to perform the deed. I love how in the book, even though one or two times they do say sex outright, whenever it's referring to him specifically having intercourse with Hong Mei, it's described as doing that thing, really underscoring how childish they are, how just completely immature they are about the things that they're doing, and how at its core, like I said, it really is empty and devoid of humanity or empathy. When he can't get it up, one of the ways that she is able to help him get it up is to slap him and beat his penis until it starts to get hard. And it's just comical how many times he goes to perform the deed and then falls completely limp and is flaccid and is unable to do it, which I just really is a reflection of how there is so much fervor. There was so much fervor at the time around the Cultural Revolution, but at its core, there was nothing there. There was no real human connection to any of it. And I think this is kind of another point to the whole broader concept of revolution, but the way people revolutionize, in the sense that when it comes to extremism, you have, how do I say this? God. Okay, I can't really think of a nice, clean way to phrase this, but basically, when it comes to extremism, if you keep going with extremism, then it has no end until everybody falls off a cliff. Like what you revolted to have this communist revolution, and then you revolted because the previous people weren't communist enough, and then you're going to revolt again because the next people aren't communist enough, and then you're going to revolt again because the next people don't believe hard enough, and it becomes revolution for the sake of revolution rather than any kind of actual belief in ideology, which kind of ties into the linguistic aspect of it that intrigues me so much. But I see this a lot in America with either liberals who sort of change language so much that people who once were considered progressive are now considered not progressive enough, or considered conservative or old school or whatever. Meanwhile, on the right side, you have rhinos, people who aren't true Republicans because they don't buy into everything that Donald Trump says or whatever. And just how these extremist camps just keep feeding on this fuel of fervor that at its core is hollow, because it has long since ceased to be about the actual thing that is meant to be at the core of the revolution. And this is where I kind of want to transition into what I find so fascinating about the book, which I think is really summed up near the end in the phrase, we revolutionaries youth didn't fear heaven or earth, and instead all we feared was that you might elevate everything to a level of ideological abstraction. And that, I think, is really at the heart of so much of what is going on here, because it ties back into the way that the quotes are being misused and abused in order to justify their own revolutionary actions. You see this a lot with Christians and the way that they use Bible quotes to justify whatever it is they're saying. But if you go back and you actually read the quote in the context that it's being said, most often it's being taken grossly out of context. Or if you add additional context historically, if you add additional context based on what comes later in the Bible, what ends up happening is a lot of these Bible quotes don't paint the whole picture. And people are taking these individual quotes and recontextualizing them, divorcing them from the core of the word, of the message, and turning it into justification for their own actions. And it's the same thing that's going on here with so many of the speeches. So, for example, you repeatedly use the phrase, revolution is not a dinner party, whenever things are going tough or when things get challenging. But specifically, at the start, he uses it to talk about his own struggles. But as the book goes on, as he becomes a more privileged person, it starts to shift to really being about how other people shouldn't complain. It's deeply ironic that they talk about, there's a scene later on where they're dealing with one of the party heads, and they're talking about revolution and how revolution is always for the good of the people, as they sit in an esteemed cadre leader of the area, the province. I don't remember the exact details, to be honest, when it comes to the exact assignments of provincial leader versus cadre leader versus mayor versus revolutionary leaders and whatnot. I'm not entirely clear on what the exact division is there, but basically very, very high-ranking official. And they're talking about the importance of the struggle and the revolution and how the revolution exists for the people. And this is after they have essentially outed somebody for returning to an old individual farming system that has produced way more than the collectivist farming system. But since it allows for private ownership of land, this leads to the person who does it being prisoned, and everything that these people made, despite it being literally 3 to 4 times more productive than their revolutionary province area, the fact that it was done via these private ownership and this reversion to capitalism means that the whole thing has to be scrapped and everything goes back to the communist way, and it's really their fault for not believing in the commune. So you have this kind of whole arc about production, and at the conclusion of this arc, after Aizhong and Hong Mei have outed these people and gotten them in massive trouble, leading to multiple people being killed and arrested and committing suicide, they're in this room where they're set before a table, not just a table, 4 tables of the most luxurious food, of which it's supposed to be a party featuring all the top people in this area, and only one other person shows up, and it's talking about how flies are literally eating this decadent meal because it's sitting at empty tables. And it really just highlights and underscores the hollowness of it all, the emptiness of the words behind the revolution, and how people get so caught up in slogans that the essence of the slogans, that the meaning, the actual meaning, humanitarian meaning contained within the slogans becomes impossible for them to process. And you see this so much, not even in China, but it's such a scary thing when words cease to have humanistic meaning attached to them and become nothing more than empty ideological justification, because then it becomes malleable to the individual to take and abuse. And you see this all the time with things shifting. Phrases, woke and its new meaning, PC and the way that meaning changed over time, MAGA and how that has been changed. Yes, we can. I'm with her. Political slogans are scary things, and when people forget the humanitarian, the real reality behind it, then they become just radicalized, but radicalized in service of nothing. Just endless radicals who create spirals of hate and misery in which people die, and yet these individuals responsible for their death are utterly incapable of recognizing their own hand in how things turned out the way that they turned out. Multiple times, Aizhung talks about how if you leave me alone, I won't strike at you, but I have to strike back at you because you struck at me first. Completely ignoring the fact that he has repeatedly, from the start, stricken out against people for no reason other than his own impetus, his own impotence. Anyway, his own weaknesses, which is really embodied in this temple, which he wants more than anything else to blow up, strictly because he dislikes what it embodies in terms of the old ways, the ways in which he is stuck being a peasant. But really, all the people that he has damaged and that he has hurt along his way to this revolution mean absolutely nothing to him. And it makes him and Hong Mei really the scariest kinds of people, because they are actually incapable of seeing their own hand as anything other than following the rules as written, and everything else as sort of owed to them for their loyalty. They have no self-reflection, they have no empathy, they have no sympathy, they see nothing except what they want to see. In a sense, they can't even be called evil, because evil, at least to my understanding of evil, requires a certain awareness of its own evil. In this case, they don't see what they did as wrong. They don't see what they did as anything short of absolutely necessary to the greater good. They sincerely believe that their selfish actions, which lead to lower production, scared people, multiple deaths, and just overall a huge amount of misery and suffering for this town, the city, this region, they view this all as collective good, as them acting for the greater good, because they are just so self-obsessed. And that is like the scariest kind of person. The kind of person who, like I said, blames absolutely everybody else for their own failings and isn't deflecting. They're not deflecting in the sense that they know they're at fault, but they refuse to see it. They actually do not possess that part of themselves that is capable of that level of reflection. And the problem with these kinds of slogans, with these kinds of revolutions, is that they create environments for these kinds of radical nut jobs to come in and take control over the situation, which really ends up being as much about revolution itself, but not just revolution, but also just political extremism. And even though this is a book about China and the communist, or not the communist, the Cultural Revolution, I dare anybody to read it and not be able to find certain parallels in society, in Western democratic societies. Even the entire hatred of the old traditions and the desire to create something new and beautiful by destroying these old historical monuments is such a common thing that you see today in America via the sort of historical revisionism and the desire to disregard a lot of, to kind of like rewrite history in a way that favors whatever political affiliation you follow today. And you see a lot of people like Aizhong and Hong Mei who rise to prominence in these kinds of environments. And it's, to me, it's a warning against this kind of blind devotion to things, but it's a warning that's going to fall on deaf ears, because ultimately it lies at the hands of the people in charge to control the temperature, to tone people down. And it's just too politically effective to let people run rampant, to let them to stoke this kind of fire, even if, as this book shows, as the Cultural Revolution as a whole being a massive failure shows, it ends in failure, because it becomes an inferno that can't be controlled and just consumes itself. It needs direction. It needs focus. And while this is very much a book rooted in Chinese history, like all good books, it really speaks to that broader human nature, that broader aspect of human nature. So yeah, where Mo Yan was way more societal, gave you a much more not accurate, but a much more sort of broad view of the historical context of a lot of these things, bringing up like the four gangs and the broader societal view of things. What Yan Lianke has... Lianke? I'm just wondering how that's pronounced now. What he has accomplished with Hard Like Water is to definitely give a much more psychological insight into the type of people who come into power during extremely turbulent times, and how much of it is really a reflection of their own weakness, and how they take and abuse language that they themselves don't understand. And it's important, even though I was kind of winding down, one thing that I really missed on stressing, but I have to stress, it's important that you appreciate that Aizhong is not illiterate. While he does have an ego the size of the moon and brags about his own writing and says he should be a great poet or whatever, the fact of the matter is he is a literate person who has very effective writing, very persuasive writing, can compose a speech, and can articulate himself very well. He is a very charming and persuasive person. And it's exactly because of that that he is so scary. When I say that he's all about the words themselves and not the actual content of them, that isn't to suggest that he's illiterate. And this is, going back to what I was saying about their fear being abstractions. This is exactly what I mean. I see this a lot today too, with people who think that just because they read, that they're somehow smarter than other people, or, just because another person reads, well, they must be smart. And that's not exactly the case. The question is, are you picking up on deeper thoughts, deeper things while you're reading, or are you just picking up the most surface level things from the book? Again, are you empathizing with the character? Are you sympathizing with the character? Are you looking at the setting? Are you looking at are you comparing that against your own life? Are you engaging with the heart, with the essence of the words? Which isn't necessarily to say that you have to see it, like let's say my way, or that there's only one way to look at things. That's not it. It's just a question of, did you read Gatsby to be able to say that you read Gatsby, or did you actually read Gatsby and empathize with each of the characters, with their positions, with the structure at the time, and with your own life and your own existence? And if you didn't, then why not? And, it's not saying that you're going to feel that way about every single book, but even the books that you don't feel that way for, that you don't resonate with, you should still be using them as an opportunity to ask yourself why. And it's only by encouraging this kind of self-reflection, by this kind of abstraction, that we start to understand ourselves, that we start to develop and cultivate not just sympathy and empathy for other people, but a better understanding of ourselves. So that's why, even though the sexual aspects and the revolutionary aspects are certainly the biggest, I think, themes of the book, for me, what really spoke to me was the linguistics aspects, or the linguistic aspect of it, and how it takes words that come from one place, guts them of any of their depth, and repurposes them into just shallow repetitions used to justify the actions of somebody who at their core ultimately has nothing there. So, interesting book. It's kind of difficult to recommend, just in the sense that it is so overwritten. Feels kind of like mean to say, but yeah, I think that there are parts where absolutely things could have been cut and could have made for a much easier read. But nonetheless, I think an intriguing book. And one that definitely has value, and I hope the right people can sort of find it and resonate with it, because I know too many people like this. And while that's frustrating for me to read, I definitely think that it's important for other people to think about. So join me next time when I talk about Peter Hanke. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I don't know if I'm looking forward to this one, guys. See you then.